Skeptics scoff, scroll past, and move on, but the ground of the Middle East keeps whispering the same stubborn story. Stone by stone, seal by seal, tunnel by tunnel, it keeps saying, the Bible does not blink. The wild part is how ordinary the moments look at first. A volunteer's trowel hits something tiny. A shepherd tosses a stone. A lab tech stares through a microscope at letters no one has seen in 2.5 millennia. No smoke, no stage lights, no press conference. Just the sound of truth rising from the dust. Start where almost no one expects it. In a burial cave on a Jerusalem hillside in 1979. Archaeologist Gabriel Barkay is supervising a survey at Ketef Hinnom, just southwest of the old city. The team is not chasing headlines. They are cataloging tombs. Then, a kid from the youth volunteers slips his hand into a dusty niche and finds what looks like 2 metal cigarette butts. They are blackened and as delicate as onion skin. They turn out to be tightly rolled silver scrolls, barely an inch long. Weeks of painstaking conservation follow. Layers of corrosion peel away. Letters come into focus. Paleo-Hebrew script stares back from the 7th century BCE. Then the shock lands. The words are not random. They are scripture, not a paraphrase, not an echo. The priestly blessing from Numbers 6, etched into silver hundreds of years before the Babylonian exile. YHWH spelled out, bless you and keep you, compressed into ancient letters on bracelets of faith. The earliest known citation of biblical text on earth. Older than the manuscripts in any medieval codex. Older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. The divine name is not silent ink on a later scribe's page. It is hammered into metal in the days of the last kings of Judah. The claim that core biblical blessings were invented centuries later collapses in a single unrolled shimmer of silver. Roll north along the Dead Sea shoreline, and the story jumps 9 years forward and 2,000 years back. A teenage Bedouin shepherd lobs a stone into a cave above Qumran in 1947 and hears pottery crack. Inside sit jars wrapped like mummies, their mouths sealed. Inside the jars sit scrolls. Inside the scrolls sits a time capsule for every armchair critic who says the Bible morphed through centuries of telephone game copying. The great Isaiah scroll labeled 1 Quaiza'ah unrolls at more than 7 meters long. It comes from around 125 BCE. That puts it roughly 1,000 years older than the Isaiah in the famous Leningrad Codex used for many modern translations. Scholars line up the ancient lines with the later ones. The match lands like a drumbeat. Thought to be lost words materialize with only minor spelling variants and marginal differences that do not erase meaning. The servant songs sit where they should sit. The promises to the nations remain unedited. The bones of the text stand exactly where prophets and scribes placed them. The scrolls include Habakkuk, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Samuel, and more. All the while, the caves make a statement that cannot be argued away. The text of the Hebrew Bible was copied with a precision that embarrasses modern dismissals. Even the tiny slips tell their own story of honesty. Where a scribe corrected, the correction is visible. The scrolls are not propaganda. They are the work of a community that treated words as sacred architecture. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not pretend to answer every curious detail in every book. They do something quieter and stronger. They ratify a lineage, a fidelity, a stubbornness in the text that modern cynicism misjudged. That shepherd's stone did not just crack a jar. It cracked a narrative of textual chaos and let light into a cave of assumptions. Keep your eyes on carved stone now, because a single chipped fragment in northern Israel kneecapped a century of smug claims. For decades, some said King David was national mythology, a heroic saga inflated beyond recognition. Then, 1993 arrived at Tel Dan, a ruin near the borders of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Archaeologists led by Avraham Buren, expose a basalt fragment in an ancient wall. The letters are Aramaic, cut by an enemy of Israel sometime in the 9th century BCE. Gila Cook, an epigrapher, reads the line that detonates the debate by D. Dwed. The House of David. There it sits, raw and unambiguous, in an Aramaean victory monument, likely commissioned by Hazael of Damascus, or a successor, boasting of defeats inflicted on Israel and Judah. The names of kings from 2 kings flicker through the inscription's gaps. Joram of Israel, Ahaziah of Judah. Dynasties and deaths mingle with battle verbs. Scholars argue the political spin, because ancient kings wrote like modern press secretaries, but they stop arguing about David being fiction. In one broken stone, outside the Bible, from an opponent's chisel, David is a dynasty. The language is the language of realpolitik, not myth. An enemy recorded a royal line, named after David, not a campfire song, not a late priestly flourish. A dynasty title in situ. Anyone who claimed every Israelite king's list was theological propaganda now faced a basalt sentence they could not edit. The Tel Don Stele forced a pivot from dismissal to discussion. The scriptures had been saying, David founded a house. An enemy's monument said the same. Time to step across the Jordan to a black stone that burned once and still burns in museums. The Mesha Stele, also known as the Moabite Stone, surfaced in 1868 at Dibon in Jordan. A missionary and a French scholar rushed to obtain it. Local tribes, fearing a loss of tribal honor and wealth, heated it in a fire and doused it with cold water, shattering it to pieces. Even that did not bury the story. A squeezed impression had been taken in time. The fragments were gathered, sold, and carried to Paris, where the Louvre reconstructed most of the text. It is a royal inscription by Mesha, king of Moab. The inscription's voice is not Israelite. Mesha exalts Chemosh, the god of Moab, and recounts his revolt from Israel. The names leap off the stone like sparks. Omri, king of Israel, a son of Omri, Ataroth, Nebo, Medeba. Each place had been written into 2 Kings 3 long before anyone knew this stone existed. The narratives do not perfectly align, because they come from opposite sides of the battlefield. Israel's text describes a coalition campaign. Mesha's text shouts his triumphs. They are not the same angle of the same camera, yet they are clearly the same war. The stone even mentions the name of YHWH in a line describing an Israelite sanctuary. That one detail alone undermines the claim that biblical Israel fabricated its God centuries later. Mesha names Israel's God as Israel's God in the 9th century BCE. Some scholars, notably André Lemaire and others in recent re-examinations, have proposed that a contested line can be read as House of David. Others push back, urging caution. Even without that debated line, the Moabite stone ties names, places, and events to a world the Bible already described. It is not miracle propaganda. It is enemy propaganda that overlaps with biblical history so tightly that silence becomes impossible. Now watch a Syrian stone turn Jerusalem's survival into a stubborn footnote the ancient superpower could not spin away. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, marched west to crush a rebellion. He steamrolled city after city. He besieged Lachish, a Judean fortress south of Jerusalem, with a siege ramp still visible on the ground today. His sculptors immortalized the assault in room after room at Nineveh, reliefs found by Austin Henry Layard and others in the 19th century. The Lachish reliefs are gruesome and precise. Archers rise on the ramp, battering rams grind forward. Civilians trudge into exile. Sennacherib wanted everyone to see what happened to those who resisted Assyria. Then comes the Taylor prism, one of several nearly identical 6-sided clay prisms inscribed with Assyrian cuneiform. now in the British Museum and in other collections. The text brags about trapping Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. 46 fortified cities of Judah fell, 200,000 captives carried away, tribute extracted. The prism unspools victory after victory. Then the boasts stop short of one thing. No claim of conquering Jerusalem appears. Assyrian kings never skipped a chance to boast. They recorded their wins and spun their losses, but they did not pretend a conquered prize was unconquered. Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem. His own summary admits it indirectly by what it does not claim. 2 Kings 18:19, Isaiah 36:37, and 2 Chronicles 32 describe a crisis that ends with Assyria withdrawing and Jerusalem still standing. The Bible gives a theological reason for the retreat. The Assyrian record gives a political face-saving version. The stones agree on the punchline. The capital of Judah did not fall. The dirt at Lachish backs up the carnage. Burn layers, arrowheads, the remains of the siege ramp rising like a frozen wave. The palace reliefs match the excavations like an ancient film still. The prism matches the biblical narrative's outcome. No one document tells the whole story. The archive of stones tells it together. The brass tacks engineering behind Hezekiah's survival adds water to the picture. The Bible says Hezekiah diverted the water of the Gihon spring and brought it into the city. That verse sits in 2 Kings 20:22 and 2 Chronicles 32. For centuries that line sounded like civic exaggeration. Then explorers and archaeologists crawled through a tunnel under the city of David, all 533 meters of it. Hezekiah's tunnel still carries cold water from the spring to the pool of Siloam. The miners cut from 2 ends, snaking through limestone in a winding path that looks more like a river following geology than engineers with a plan. Somewhere under the ridge they met. In 1880, a boy climbed the tunnel wall and found an inscription carved a few feet from the exit. The Siloam inscription describes the last moments of the 2 teams, the sound of picks echoing, the final breakthrough, and the flow of water. The letters are Paleo-Hebrew. The words are mundane and magnificent. No propaganda, no flattery, just the memory of a job finished in time. Geological studies support a date in Hezekiah's era. Radiocarbon stains the timeline. It all converges on a king who secured water before Assyria came. The Chronicles line stops being a slogan and becomes a tunnel you can walk while your shoes get wet. The skeptical critique once loved to laugh at the Gospel of John for being too symbolic, too literary, too unconcerned with geography. The laughter fades when stones rise in the exact places John describes. In John 5, the scene lands near the sheep gate at a pool called Bethesda with 5 porticos. Scholars waved it away for a century. No 5-sided pool existed in the old city, they said. Then, excavators, including Conrad Schick in the late 19th century, and later archaeologists, uncovered a complex of pools north of the Temple Mount. 2 large basins divided by a central dam with colonnades around them, and along the dividing wall created 5 covered porticos, 5 walkways surrounding and bisecting 2 pools. The layout matches John's description with photographic precision. The pool complex shows phases of construction, including Roman-era improvements. There were healing associations in the area, possibly connected to an Asclepion, a healing sanctuary, which explains why John mentions crowds of the sick lying in the porticos. John wrote like a witness who knew the stones under his feet. Travel south in the city to the pool of Siloam in John 9. For years, a small Byzantine-era pool hosted tour groups, charming but late. In 2004, construction to repair a sewer line in the City of David area exposed steps peeking out of the earth. Archaeologists Elisha Krohn and Ronnie Reich began to uncover a grand, wide pool with broad steps descending on 3 sides. Coins and pottery from the 1st century flowed out of the mud. The pool's dimensions, and dating match the time of Jesus. The step arrangement fits ritual bathing patterns from the period. The path from the Gihon spring to Siloam runs water under your ankles. John's story of the blind man washing mud from his eyes aligns with a real pool you can stand in. The topography of John's Jerusalem is not a late meditation. It is a grounded memory of courtyards, steps, and gates. This is where the story shifts from Israel's kings to Rome's governors, because a single Latin slab found in 1961 shut down the idea that the Gospels made up a villain. In the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, the Italian archaeologist Antonio Frova excavated a stone reused as a step in the theater. The inscription was damaged but legible. The words Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, appeared in crisp Latin. Another line mentions a Tiberium, likely a building dedicated to Tiberius. Pilate is no longer just a name in Josephus and the Gospels. He sat on a stone, left a stone, and a stone survived. The title matters. Prefect matches Roman administrative terminology from the early 1st century. Tacitus, writing later, uses procurator as a generic term for governors, but a contemporary inscription ties Pilate to the precise title of his decade. Coins minted under Tiberius also match his term of office. The stone anchors the name, like a bolt to the jetty. Nearby, later excavations in the site of Herod's palace and administrative center yielded a simple bronze ring stamped with the name Pilatus, published widely in 2018 after earlier discovery. The ring probably belonged to someone in Pilate's administration rather than Pilate himself, since officials often used rings stamped with a superior's name. Even so, the cluster of finds stitches Pilate harder into the historical fabric. A step in a theater, a name on a ring, a title in Latin. All of it dovetails with a prefect who washed his hands and sent a Galilean to a Roman cross. One more name from the Passion narrative comes out of a bone box in a family tomb. In November 1990, workers constructing a park in southern Jerusalem broke into a rock-cut burial cave in the Peace Forest. Israel Antiquities Authority archaeologist Zvi I. Greenhut arrived and documented 12 ossuaries, small limestone chests used for secondary burial in the 1st century, one ornate box, or 2 inscriptions in Aramaic in different hands. The name read Yehoseph bar Caiapha, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Another inscription on the same ossuary included the name Caiaphas alone. Caiaphas is not a common family name. The Gospel writers and Josephus mention a high priest named Joseph called Caiaphas, who presided over the council that condemned Jesus. The ossuary's decoration and the cave's contents fit a family of high status. Coin finds and pottery align with the early 1st century CE. The debate over whether this exact ossuary belongs to the high priest of the Gospels continues in technical detail, as does every responsible academic discussion. The weight of the evidence points in one direction. The names match. The time matches. The grandeur matches. The stones of the Second Temple period refuse to erase the very people the New Testament names. A high priest with a rare family name and a prefect with a Roman title lock into their historical setting. It becomes harder to claim late fiction when the ground supplies the guest list. The habit of calling Luke sloppy takes another hit when inscriptions outside the Gospels keep aligning with what Acts records. A rescript of Emperor Claudius to the city of Delphi mentions the proconsul Gallio and fixes him in Achaia, around 57-2 CE. That aligns neatly with Paul in Corinth in Acts 18. An inscription in Corinth honors an Erastus who laid a pavement at his own expense, matching Paul's greeting in Romans 16:23 to Erastus the city treasurer, likely the same official. In the hills near Abila, inscriptions reference Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene, in the time of Tiberius, while earlier historians scoffed that Luke conflated an older Lysanias from a different era. The stones supply more than trivia. They trace a network of names, offices, and timings that form a lattice under Luke's narrative. Instead of a patchwork of pious stories, the New Testament reads like a travel diary strewn with civic plaques. Yet nothing beats the moment when even the Most High God becomes a word in a stone archive outside the Bible. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls already whispered the divine name in the 7th century BCE. The Kuntilat Adrut inscriptions from the early 8th century BCE scribble YHWH into blessings on desert plaster. The Arad Ostraka from a fortress in Judah toss House of YHWH into a line of military instructions and supply lists. The word Yahweh is not a later invention retrofitted into an ancient story. The name lived on lips, shields, and silver before exiles ever wept by Babylonian rivers. That reality matters, because claiming Israel invented its God late requires more than a theory. It requires erasing lines of ink and etchings of letters across centuries. Archaeology refuses to erase them. Zoom back to Assyria for a final reality check on how Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE looks in 3 dimensions. Hezekiah's broad wall segments lie exposed in the Jewish quarter of the Old City, a thickness of more than 7 meters in places, built in a rush to defend the western hill. Pottery and stratigraphy pin the construction to the time of the Assyrian threat. The Bible mentions fortification projects and enrolling citizens to wall building. Archaeology forces you to stand by blocks taller than a man and imagine the sound of chisels and shouted orders. The fortifications swallow skepticism whole with their mass. Then pivot to Egypt, where inscriptions at Karnak list a devastating campaign by Shoshenq I, the biblical Shishak, in 925 BCE. The carved topography on the Bubastite portal names towns in Israel and Judah, including a list that almost picks your ear with its familiarity. Megiddo, Beth Shean, Arad may be present in a debated line. The campaign aligns with 1 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 12, where Shishak invades in the 5th year of Rehoboam. The relief does not exist to support the Bible. It exists to glorify an Egyptian king. It does it by listing the loot of Palestinian cities in the early divided kingdom period. Again, names overlap, political realities sink, and the text refuses to crumble under a long, slow gaze. A different kind of confirmation comes from the sheer ordinariness of Nazareth in the early 1st century. Sneers about its non-existence have circulated for years, fed by the lack of early mentions in certain Roman texts. Then, spades began to turn. A 2009-2010 excavation led by Yordina Alexandra revealed a courtyard house from the time of Jesus, with rock-cut cisterns and storage pits, in modern Nazareth. Other digs in the Sisters of Nazareth site and around the Basilica of the Annunciation uncovered early Roman-era structures and agricultural installations. The material remains fit, a small agrarian village in the hills, a place beneath the notice of imperial chroniclers, a place easily mocked by city elites, a place exactly like the one the Gospels describe, out of which no one expected anything good. Nothing flashy, everything real. It is easy to claim that archaeology should hand over a smoking gun in every chapter. The actual discipline specializes in patient cumulative testimony, one layer after another, one shard beside another, one name beside one date. The weight builds until even a skeptic's scales tilt. The Bible's content does not live or die by any single find. It lives in an ecosystem of material culture that refuses to contradict its core claims at every turn. Over and over the stones say the same thing. The writers knew their kings. They knew their gates and pools. They knew their governors and priests. They knew their blessings. Shift back to where this started. The blessing on silver from Ketef Hinnom stands like a waterfall over the centuries. Numbers 6 was on the lips of priests in the 7th century BCE. That means the text's core existed well before exile and temple destruction. That pushes composition debates to a different battlefield. That war cannot erase the metal. The letters of the divine name look back at you across time. They do not blink. Add one more honest admission that the best evidence makes. Where the Bible leaves gaps, archaeology rarely fills the whole cavity. Jericho's destruction layers are debated with ferocious energy, with Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s arguing for an earlier Bronze Age destruction than Joshua, and later re-examinations probing evidence for occupation through Iron Age complexities. Responsible voices acknowledge complexity. That acknowledgement does not erase the avalanche of alignment elsewhere. The serious conversation then becomes about method and layers, not broad-stroke dismissal of the entire text as unmoored from reality. Follow the through line to the edges of exile and return, and the stones keep talking. The Cyrus cylinder from Babylon, etched in Akkadian cuneiform, around 539–530 BCE, and now in the British Museum, records Cyrus's policy of allowing exiled peoples to return and rebuild their sanctuaries. It does not name Judah directly, but it resonates with the policy reflected in Ezra 1, where Cyrus grants Judahites permission to rebuild the temple. Critics who once painted Ezra as rosy propaganda now stare at a broader imperial pattern carved in clay. The God of heaven, in biblical terms, uses a Persian monarch's policy that the monarch describes in his way. The Bible's version fits alignment, not isolation. The Balaam inscription from Deir Allah in Jordan, from the 8th century BCE, surprises in a different way. It mentions a seer named Balaam, son of Beor, a name and formula known predominantly from Numbers 20–24. The Deir Allah text is not the same Balaam story, and its theology is different. The overlapping name announces that the biblical writers included figures known beyond Israel's borders. Balaam was not a generic cipher. He was part of a wider tapestry of ancient divination lore. The Bible appropriated and reframed him. That kind of move reads like history, not fantasy. Now imagine the study of ancient seals and bullae, the little clay lumps used to seal documents, each bearing a seal impression with a name and title. Jeremiah's world comes into focus. A bulla, bearing the name Gemariah, son of Shaphan, surfaced in the City of David excavations in the 1980s, precisely the official who supported Jeremiah and whose chamber in the temple complex is named in Jeremiah 36. Other bullae carry names like Baruch, son of Neriah, although many of those are unprovenanced and debated. But the emergence of names, titles, and offices mentioned in Jeremiah's text keeps making the prophets more human and more precise, not doomsayers floating in myth. Civil servants with seals and desks. You can feel the cumulative weight pressing into a single conclusion. The Bible does not need a rescue plan. It needed a fair trial. Once you give it that, and let the stones speak, you hear the same line repeated across languages, borders, and centuries. The storytelling is rooted in places where shovels are still dirty. The prayers were etched when empires thought they were immortal. The names did not sit alone on a page. They signed documents. They received tribute. They lost battles and built tunnels and dedicated theaters and sealed tombs. The human element refuses to sit down. The authors of the Bible wrote it into everything. They wrote it into waterworks and city walls. They wrote it into appointments and lawsuits. They wrote it into copper mines and caravan stops. They wrote it onto silver scrolls, buried with the dead, so the living could remember the blessing. Archaeology's greatest secret is not that it crushes faith or props up credulity. Its greatest secret is that it tells the truth with dirt under its fingernails. It names the governors. It weighs the coins. It counts the steps around a pool. It stands silent until dug, and then it refuses to shut up once the air hits it. So here are the 9 moments that keep rewiring the conversation, each one a door that creaked open and refused to close. The Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls from 1979, bearing numbers 6 and the name of YHWH from the 7th century BCE. The Dead Sea Scrolls from 1947 onward, anchoring the Hebrew Bible's textual fidelity 1,000 years earlier than medieval manuscripts. The Tel Dan Stele, from 1993–90. 4. Naming the House of David outside the Bible in 9th century Aramaic. The Mesha Stele, from 5868. A Moabite king's own account, intersecting with two kings, naming Omri, Israel, and YHWH. The Sennacherib prisms and the Lachish reliefs, celebrating conquest while conceding Jerusalem, stood, aligning with Isaiah and Kings. Hezekiah's tunnel and the Siloam inscription. The engineering and the eyewitness mark to match the chronicler's sentence. The pools of Bethesda and Siloam, John's 5 porticos, and the blind man's steps stamped into Jerusalem's stone. The Pilate stone, carved Latin that ties a Roman prefect to Judea and to the political machinery of the Passion. The Caiaphas ossuary, a high priest's family name scratched into limestone in the time frame of the Gospels. Each discovery opened the window wider. Each one chipped away at bluster and replaced it with bedrock. Each one said the writers were not guessing. They were remembering. The pattern matters as much as the particulars. People once mocked Hittites as a biblical fantasy, until archaeology put their empire on maps and their legal tablets in museums. People once said David was a national fairy tale, until a fragment in the north said otherwise. People once dismissed John's geography until workmen uncovered steps and porticos where he said they stood. People once thought Luke mixed up officials, until Latin and Greek inscriptions made his footnotes look meticulous. Layer after layer insists on the same point. The Bible keeps its feet on the ground. The supernatural claims are not placed into a vacuum of invented places or impossible chronologies. They speak from within a world where inscriptions match names, and where walls and pools still cast shadows. This does not mean archaeology agrees on every interpretation, because responsible scholarship rarely turns into a chorus. Debates over dates, readings, and provenience keep the field honest. The reading of a line on the Mesha Stele remains argued. The authenticity of some unprovenanced bullae is rightly scrutinized. The exact dating of certain walls in Jerusalem threads a needle through layers and fill. None of those realities reverse the long arc of convergence. The honest disagreements are the maintenance crew in the house, not a demolition team. Pay attention to how many of these finds were not designed to support the Bible. The Moabite stone exalts Chemosh. The Taylor prism magnifies Sennacherib. The Pilate stone dedicates a building to Tiberius. The Arad Ostraka shuffle military supplies. The Mesha Stele crows about the humiliation of Israel. The Balaam inscription sits inside a different religious tradition. These stones are hostile witnesses or indifferent witnesses. They still align. That is the kind of testimony that moves juries. That is the kind of evidence that shrugs at hype and keeps whispering its piece of the truth. One last image locks the whole gallery together. Imagine standing in the city of David with your hand on time-smoothed blocks from Hezekiah's wall. Walk down the slope and into the dark to feel Gihon's water skimming around your ankles in a tunnel carved in a panic more than 2,700 years ago. Step back into the light and sit on the stairs of the Pool of Siloam, stairs pulled from mud that held first-century coins in its grip for 2 millennia. Climb the hill to the remains of the Temple Mount, and then look north toward the ruins of Bethesda, the sun throwing shadows through imaginary porticos now traced in stone. Then drive to the coast, feel the Mediterranean wind at Caesarea, and read Pontius Pilate's name in Latin like a signature on sea spray. Whatever a person decides about the claims of prophets, kings, and apostles, this much is nailed down. The world of the Bible matches the world underfoot. The text does not float above history. It crouches in a cave, sits on a gate, curves around a pool, and speaks Latin in a seaside theater. Stones do not flatter, and they do not argue. They simply sit until someone listens. The 9 discoveries you just walked past refuse to shut up. They speak from graves and caves, palaces and tunnels, pools and prisons. They testify straight. They say the Bible did not lie to you about its places, its people, and its plot within history. The names are real. The dates are tangible. The politics are raw. And the water is cold. The ground says so.